This helicopter was faster, more agile, and it won state trials not once, but twice. Yet after 20 years of so-called serial production, the Russian army had exactly 16 of them in service. Today you will find out how bureaucracy, industrial politics, and the collapse of an empire killed the finest attack helicopter the Soviet Union ever built. On December 16, 1976, the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union issued an emergency decree, one that would permanently alter the course of Soviet helicopter engineering. What triggered it was not an internal review and not a general's report on equipment shortfalls. The trigger came from the other side of the world. 6 days earlier, on December 10th, United States Secretary of the Army Martin Hoffman announced to the international community that Hughes Aircraft had won the competition for America's next-generation attack helicopter. The world would later come to know that machine as the Apache, a purpose-built weapons platform designed specifically to hunt tanks and tear apart armored columns on the modern battlefield. The Soviet leadership grasped the implications immediately. If the Americans were fielding a dedicated tank-killer helicopter, the USSR needed a credible counter, and it needed one without delay. The development contract went straight to the Mill Design Bureau, a decision that surprised no one. After all, it was Mill's engineers who had given the Soviet Army the Mi-24, already in frontline service, and regarded as the backbone of Army aviation's striking power. The Mill Bureau was enormous, deeply connected, and thoroughly accustomed to receiving every major land helicopter contract that came out of Moscow. The Kamov Design Bureau, meanwhile, had always worked in a different world. Naval helicopters, shipboard platforms, anti-submarine machines. Nobody was rushing to hand Kamov a land combat brief. But Kamov's team had a strong and very different opinion about how that should change. Even while Nikolai Ilyich Kamov himself was still alive, his bureau had attempted to offer the military a land-based derivative of the naval Ka-25 back in the 1960s, when the future Mi-24 was still on the drawing board. At that time, however, the Ground Forces Command was completely sold on Mill's concept of a flying, armored infantry carrier, and Kamov's proposal was shelved before a single prototype was ever built. Now, with an entirely new generation of combat helicopter on the table, Kamov's engineers concluded they simply could not afford to let this opportunity slip through their hands a second time. In 1978, something happened that reads less like Soviet industrial history and far more like a scene cut from a Cold War spy thriller. Yevgeny Vasilyevich Sudarev, the lead designer of Kamov's future machine, then known internally as the V-80, learned that on that particular day, Mill's bureau was scheduled to present a scale model of the forthcoming Mi-28 to a delegation of military representatives. When Mill's engineers looked up and saw a Kamov designer standing in their own presentation room with a competing prototype model, the reaction was volcanic. Mill's bureau at that period was powerful enough to contemplate absorbing the Kamov OKB entirely. The appearance of a Kamov man on their turf, carrying a rival design, was treated as something close to open provocation. But the military officers present in the room turned out to be less interested in institutional politics and more interested in what they were actually looking at. They examined both models, and the Kamov machine caught their attention. Small, aggressive in appearance, with no tail rotor at all and a coaxial counter-rotating rotor system at the top. It looked like nothing the Soviet Army had ever evaluated before. After that extraordinary afternoon, prolonged negotiations began at the highest levels of the military and industrial command. Senior officers understood that both designs had genuine merit, and that picking a winner based on scale models alone would be a mistake. On December 2, 1980, the Army Ground Forces Command and the Air Force Command issued a joint ruling that redrew the entire competition. The new attack helicopter would be selected through a structured, competitive evaluation process, and both Mil and Kamov would work to a common set of tactical and technical requirements. Those requirements had already been shaped by the first year of the war in Afghanistan, a conflict that was giving Soviet military planners a daily education in what a combat helicopter actually needed to do to survive and fight in a real war. Kamov's team moved fast. By spring 1981, the V-80 existed as a full-scale mock-up. Construction of the first airworthy prototype began in early 1982, and on June 17th of that year, in what would prove to be the final year of the Brezhnev era, test pilot Nikolai Pavlovich Bezdetnov eased the V-80 off the ground for the first time. A helicopter that had not existed even as a set of drawings 2 years earlier was now flying, beginning what would become a long and deeply turbulent story, one filled in equal measure with genuine triumphs, catastrophic setbacks, political betrayal, and profound injustice. As the V-80 began rising above the test airfield near Zhulebino, just outside Moscow, Kamov's team ran into a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. The aircraft was classified, but test flights were taking place not in some remote restricted range, but practically within sight of the capital, where any curious observer on the ground could easily pick out the machine's distinctly unusual silhouette. So the engineers came up with a quietly brilliant deception. They applied fake window outlines and door markings to the fuselage of the V-80, using glossy adhesive strips to simulate passenger cabin glazing. The thinking was straightforward. From the ground, the helicopter should read as just another Kamov civilian prototype, a transport or passenger test bed that no foreign intelligence service would bother to look at twice. The ruse worked beyond all expectations. Right up to 1986, American intelligence analysts, working from fragmentary intercepts and low-resolution photographs, consistently misidentified the aircraft. In Western aviation journals, the V-80, assigned the NATO reporting name Hokum, was confidently described as a two-seat tandem machine with a pilot forward and a weapons operator behind. In other words, Western analysts were attributing to the Kamov helicopter the exact crew arrangement that actually belonged to its Mil competitor. The Kamov design was, in fact, a single-seater, one of its defining characteristics. But Western intelligence had no idea. The camouflage scheme, however, produced an unexpected and dangerous side effect. During one test sortie, the reflective window strip applied to the left side of the fuselage peeled away in flight and was ingested directly into the engine intake. The engine flamed out, and the pilot was forced to manage the remainder of the flight on the single surviving power plant. In effect, the disguise had triggered an unplanned single-engine emergency, and the aircraft passed it. The helicopter came down safely, and Kamov's engineers walked away with hard evidence that their machine could sustain controlled flight on one engine. Meanwhile, the V-80's flight performance data was steadily accumulating, and the numbers were compelling. The coaxial rotor system, two counter-rotating blades stacked on the same shaft, delivered structural advantages no conventional helicopter could match. With no tail rotor to drive, The helicopter carried significantly less mechanical weight than its competitor, and every unit of engine output went directly into lift and forward thrust rather than being spent fighting the torque reaction of a single main rotor. The V-80 reached a top speed of 315 kilometers per hour. The Mi-28 managed 282. But raw speed was almost secondary. What the data showed about maneuverability was more significant still. The Kamov machine's azimuth turn rate exceeded the traverse speed of the Mi-28's chin-mounted cannon. What that meant in practical terms? The V-80 could swing its entire airframe onto a target faster than the Mi-28's gun could slew to point at the same target. In October 1983, a joint session of the Air Force Command and the Ministry of Aviation Industries Senior Board convened to address a question that could no longer be deferred. Which of the two designs would go into full series production? Advocates for the Mi-28 pressed hard on one central argument. A two-man crew is inherently more effective in combat employment. Two sets of eyes find targets faster. Two sets of hands mean the pilot can fly while the weapons officer engages. The idea that a single pilot could simultaneously manage an attack helicopter and direct its weapons at moving targets under fire, that sounded unrealistic. For a moment, it seemed as though that logic alone might be enough to override every performance advantage the V-80 had demonstrated. Then, Colonel Grigory Ivanovich Kuznetsov, representing the Air Force Research Institute, stood up. His presentation changed the entire trajectory of the meeting. Drawing directly on operational records from Mi-24 combat deployments in Afghanistan, Kuznetsov told the board that in real engagements, all target acquisition and weapon delivery functions were being handled by the pilot. The weapons operator in the rear cockpit, the man whose presence Mill had used to justify a heavier, larger design, was contributing nothing meaningful in the majority of actual combat engagements. The second crew member was, in practice, dead weight. 4 years of war in Afghanistan had generated hard statistics, and those statistics pointed unambiguously toward the single-seat concept. The session was chaired by Chief Air Marshal Pavel Stepanovich Kutakov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Force. After hearing every argument from both sides, Kutakov announced his verdict. The competition was awarded to Kamov's V-80. For Kamov's engineers, it was the outcome they had worked toward for years. For Mill, it was a blow they had no intention of absorbing quietly. And they didn't. By February 1984, barely months after the ruling, the Ministry of Aviation Industry, acting in direct defiance of the military's decision, authorized production of an experimental Mi-28 batch. The losing design bureau had called in its connections across the Soviet defense industrial complex, and the helicopter that the Army had not chosen was being built regardless. Then, on December 3rd of that same year, an event occurred that would hit Kamov's program at its most vulnerable point. Marshal Kutakov died unexpectedly. The man who had used his personal authority to place the V-80's win on record was gone, and with him went the Kamov helicopter's most powerful institutional protector. Mill's team moved within days. They lobbied for a new round of comparative trials. The competition that Kamov had already won was, in all practical effect, being reopened from scratch. The repeat evaluation was held before a senior military commission. Both sides understood exactly what was at stake. The loser would not simply forfeit a contract. They would forfeit an entire line of development for the decade ahead. Kamov brought their V-80. Mill brought a factory-fresh Mi-28 from the unauthorized production batch they had pushed through in the aftermath of the first contest. The pilots on both sides prepared to demonstrate everything their machines could do. Among Kamov's aircrew was Yevgeny Ivanovich Laryushin, one of the most accomplished test pilots in the country. Laryushin had chosen to demonstrate a tactical profile specifically designed to show the V-80's combat potential. The maneuver was a pop-up attack. The helicopter conceals itself behind natural terrain, then surges vertically above the obstacle, releases a weapons salvo, and drops immediately back into cover. In actual combat, this technique would allow an attack helicopter to strike armored vehicles while remaining almost completely protected from return fire. Laryushin initiated the sequence. The V-80 climbed sharply, and the assembled commission watched the machine hang for a moment above the terrain feature. A simulated weapons release followed, and Laryushin pulled the cyclic hard back, throwing the aircraft into a steep nose-down descent. At that moment, the program nearly ended. As the V-80 pitched aggressively downward, opposing aerodynamic loads acted simultaneously on both rotor discs. In this extreme maneuver, the rotational planes of the upper and lower blades, normally held apart by a carefully engineered safety margin, closed toward each other. The upper rotor blades struck the lower set. The collision was catastrophic. Both rotor systems disintegrated within fractions of a second, and the helicopter, completely stripped of lift, fell straight into the ground. Test pilot Yevgeny Ivanovich Laryushin did not survive. For Kamov, the disaster was total. They had lost one of the country's finest aviators, and their only flying prototype in a single moment. Their rivals at Mill now held the most powerful argument imaginable for terminating the V-80 program permanently. The coaxial system that gave the helicopter every one of its performance advantages had failed in the exact flight regime the machine had been designed to dominate: aggressive maneuvering close to the ground. The blade strike was not a component failure or a maintenance issue. It appeared to be a fundamental flaw in the underlying concept. Everyone in the room knew it. Much of the Soviet aviation establishment concluded that the V-80 program was finished. Kamov's engineers did not reach that conclusion. They ran the failure analysis, identified the root cause, and proposed a solution: increase the axial separation between the upper and lower rotor. The military leadership, impressed by that determination, kept the program alive. Comparative trials resumed in September 1985. This time, the redesigned V-80 performed every requested profile with consistent confidence. It executed the most demanding maneuvers in the evaluation syllabus. It outran and outmaneuvered the Mi-28 in every relevant performance category. And at the conclusion of the full assessment cycle, the Kamov design was again judged the superior machine. For the second consecutive time, the Military Evaluation Board had chosen the V-80. And for the second consecutive time, that verdict did not translate quickly into action. Months of bureaucratic delay followed. The industrial lobby aligned with Mill's bureau refused to accept the outcome and deployed every mechanism available to stall formal ratification of the results. 1986 came and went. 1987 arrived. Perestroika was reshaping the Soviet political landscape. Ministers changed, departments reorganized, and official recognition of Kamov's victory continued to be deferred. Only in December 1987, more than 2 full years after the trials had concluded, did a joint resolution of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers formally place the V-80's victory on record. More than 5 years had elapsed since the prototype's first flight. It appeared at last, that Kamov could proceed to series production. But the Soviet Union of the late 1980s bore almost no resemblance to the state that had issued an emergency helicopter decree within 6 days of an American announcement back in 1976. The economy was fracturing, defense appropriations were falling sharply, and the series production that Kamov's team had fought for through a decade of competition, politics, and tragedy turned out to be something entirely different from what they had imagined. The first production V-80 rolled off the assembly line at the Ukhtomsk helicopter plant in March 1989. It should have been the moment the conveyor started moving, the Army's new frontline machine arriving in numbers, regiment by regiment. It wasn't. The second production airframe was completed in April 1990, 13 months after the first. 1 helicopter per year. That was the production rate a disintegrating defense industry could sustain for a machine that had beaten every competitor it faced. The line was subsequently moved to the Arsenyev helicopter facility in the Russian Far East, where capacity was higher and where planners hoped output would finally achieve some regularity. The first Arsenyev-built aircraft was ready in May 1991. Mass production remained an abstraction.
The Soviet Union was in its final months, and with it collapsed every procurement plan that had been built over the preceding decade. In January 1992, something occurred that would have been unthinkable in the Soviet defense sector just a few years earlier. Sergei Viktorovich Mikheyev, Kamov's chief designer, addressed an international symposium in London and publicly revealed the helicopter's new official designation, Ka-50. Until that moment, the aircraft had existed outside classified channels only as the V-80. Now the world had a name for it. The public saw the machine in August 1992 at the Zhukovsky Air Show, then operating under the name Moss Aero Show. The aircraft drew immediate and intense attention, and the following month it was flown to Farnborough in England, where the Ka-50 was assessed as one of the most significant new developments in global rotorcraft design. But the single most effective piece of promotion the Ka-50 would ever receive was not an air show. It was a film. In 1993, a feature movie called Black Shark reached Soviet and Russian cinemas, and that name attached itself to the Ka-50 permanently. The film depicted the helicopter in combat operations in Afghanistan, and its unusual distinction was that the real aircraft appeared as itself, flown by its actual test pilot, with chief designer Mikheyev appearing in his own role. For millions of viewers, the Ka-50 was transformed from a classified alphanumeric index into something that felt alive. A black shark, predatory, fast, and projecting the kind of menace that was supposed to make an enemy reconsider the value of their armor. The cultural weight the film created around the helicopter was impossible to quantify precisely. In an era when defense budgets had essentially collapsed and helicopters were being assembled individually rather than by the batch, public fascination with the Ka-50 was one of the very few remaining assets Kamov had. It proved sufficient. On August 28, 1995, President Yeltsin signed the decree formally accepting the Ka-50 into service with the Russian Army. 13 years had passed from the prototype's first flight to that signature. In all that time, only a handful of aircraft had been built. The Arsenyev plant was averaging approximately 1 helicopter per year. At that pace, equipping even a single regiment to operational strength was mathematically impossible. The Army officially possessed a state-of-the-art attack helicopter. In reality, the entire Ka-50 fleet could be counted without running out of fingers. The aircraft risked becoming precisely what its critics had always predicted: an expensive, technically impressive machine that appeared at displays and in films, but never fought a real war. Then, at the end of 1999, the security situation in the North Caucasus deteriorated beyond any point at which that risk could be deferred. The Second Chechen War was at full intensity, and the command authorized the deployment of 2 Ka-50s into the operational area. It was the first, and, as events unfolded, essentially the only genuine combat deployment the Black Shark would ever undertake. The 2 aircraft arrived in Chechnya and flew combat operations from January 1st through January 29th, 2000. For the first time, a Kamov attack helicopter was engaging real targets rather than range markers. Every sortie produced operational data of a kind no controlled test environment could generate. Over 29 days, both aircraft flew at maximum sustainable tempo. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, striking hardened militant positions, suppressing crew-served weapons, and providing direct fire support to advancing ground units. In the course of that compact but high-intensity deployment, the 2 Ka-50s expended 929 unguided rockets and 3 laser-guided missiles. The numbers were unambiguous. The machines were operating at the ceiling of their capability, and the pilots who flew them were emphatic in their assessment of the Black Shark's performance under genuine combat conditions. The deployment also surfaced a vulnerability. Following one mission, a pilot reported abnormal vibration on approach to base. A ground inspection was conducted at Konkala Airfield, the primary federal aviation hub in Chechnya during those weeks. Technicians found a bullet hole in one of the main rotor blades. The helicopter had taken a hit from ground fire and returned home anyway. But continuing flight operations with a compromised blade was not an option. A field repair was not attempted. The necessary tools and spare parts did not exist at Konkala. The entire helicopter was shipped back to the Arsenyev plant. In that moment, one of the 2 Ka-50s ended its Chechen deployment prematurely, and with it, for all practical purposes, ended the Black Shark's entire operational career. The pilots who flew the Ka-50 in Chechnya were consistent and unequivocal in their evaluations. The helicopter was fast, precise in handling, exceptionally maneuverable at low altitude, and allowed a single pilot to both locate and engage targets with genuine effectiveness. Everything Colonel Kuznetsov had argued in that 1983 session, every point about the real-world irrelevance of the second crew member, had been confirmed in actual combat 17 years later. The single-seat concept had worked exactly as its designers had designed it to work. Those operational endorsements, however, did not move the institutional position. The Ministry of Defense leadership continued to resist recognizing the Ka-50 as the Army's primary attack helicopter. The stated objection had not changed: one crew member. Officials in senior positions persisted in treating that as a disqualifying deficiency, regardless of what every competitive evaluation and every operational report had shown.
Meanwhile, Mills' bureau had not stopped working. Across 3 decades of incremental development, the Mi-28 had evolved into the Mi-28N, fitted with a mast-mounted radar and fully capable of day/night all-weather operations. Through the 2000s, Kamov's helicopters continued to be assembled individually at Arsenyev. Each additional airframe consumed significant resources,
Series production, in any meaningful sense, had simply never materialized. The fleet remained too small for any organized force structure to be built around it. The Mi-28N, by contrast, was positioned for large-scale production at the Rostov helicopter plant, a facility with the industrial throughput to deliver dozens of aircraft per year. In the end, that capacity gap, not performance data, not operational evaluations, not competitive trial results, was the factor that settled the question. In 2009, after 16 Ka-50s had been completed across roughly 20 years of nominal serial production, the program was officially closed. 16 aircraft in 20 years. That is the record of a helicopter that won 2 separate state competitions, that survived the death of its test pilot on the day of a critical evaluation and came back stronger, that flew in a combat zone, expended nearly 1,000 rockets in a month, and was praised by every pilot who strapped into it. The Russian Army adopted the Mi-28N as its standard attack helicopter, the same design that the Kamov machine had outperformed in direct, formally judged competition twice. The Black Shark did not disappear entirely. As far back as 1997, a 2-seat development had already begun, one that preserved the coaxial rotor system, the predatory aerodynamic profile, and the maneuverability that had defined the Ka-50, while adding the second crew member that defense officials had insisted on throughout. In the second decade of the 21st century, that aircraft, quietly, and to many observers unexpectedly, began arriving in frontline helicopter units. Its story is worth telling separately. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and write in the comments. Was the decision to abandon the Ka-50 in favor of the Mi-28 the right one? Or did the system simply eliminate the better machine? Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are many more stories like this one. Machines and the people who built them, and the forces that determined their fate.